forward to seeing so many of you in London in August at the IHAGS conference.
Okay, well, hopefully there's something interesting for us to see there.
Looking at the session titles, there seems to be more diversity than usual. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Hopefully. Tom, would you like to?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. We are happy to see all our patrons here on Zoom, and we welcome you to join in a celebratory meeting. We also welcome our viewers on YouTube, and today we will celebrate 3 years of Sephardic World, started by David and me nearly 3 years ago. Our first broadcast was on the 5th of May. And we had more viewers then because we let everyone in on our regular meetings. And now we have limited the Zoom meetings to our patrons, to whom we are very grateful. And I give the word to David, and we will alternate in our talks.
Thank you. So I've actually just come back from a Jewish event, and it makes me realize how Sephardic the world I live in is. I went armed with hummus and lots of Middle Eastern food, and everyone there had arrived with cheesecake and rugelach and that sort of thing. And as there, I think so with Jewish genealogy. And I think the first point that we can look at is it's become apparent the differences between different Jewish genealogies. So, for example, when I started, I have both Sephardic and Ashkenazi ancestry, and I just assumed, well, Jewish genealogy is Jewish genealogy. But I think what we have, what has been cemented over the last 3 years, is that within Sephardic genealogy, certainly Western Sephardic genealogy, we're looking very much at the 17th and 18th centuries, where with Ashkenazi, it's very much 19th and 20th centuries, because they just don't have the volume of data that we have. And also, I think, at least, when I'm looking at my own Ashkenazi research, what I'm interested in is very much a single migration. In the case of my family from Lithuania and Poland to England, but I think that's fairly typical of going from the old country to the new. And also the Holocaust. I mean, there are huge gaps in the family tree that we need to fill, to find the names of these people. But I think with Sephardic genealogy, I think what we've learned, or at least the world we've created for ourselves, is I think it's much more nuanced. That's to say that we are looking at a community, obviously, that is physically moving out of the Iberian Peninsula to other places, but at the same time is moving from medievalism to modernity. And I find that we're looking very much more at things like history, at language, at culture, at, for example, the role of women in society, at institutions of the congregations, and hopefully this is something that we can offer to those researching Ashkenazi genealogy. And I think that we're, as I say, if I take the one big issue, it is that in one of my genealogies, I'm just looking at a single journey, and in the other, it's like Brownian motion, like Sephardim, like flying all over the place and going backwards and forwards. And I think that leads into to Tom's first point.
Yes, what we discovered is that Sephardic communities all over the world kept in contact with each other and were inextricably linked to each other. Sephardic communities were able to maintain their distinct cultural identity despite living in societies that were often hostile to Jews. And this was due in part to the close-knit communal structures which provided support and solidarity within the community, but it did not stop at boundaries. And in this way, the Sephardic community formed the first globalized community in the world. Sephardim built commercial and financial networks. For example, a few bankers in The Hague were able to get together 2 million guilders within a few weeks to finance the invasion of England by William III. David would not say invasion. He would say that the British invited the Dutch.
Yes.
In Holland, we call it an invasion. So Sephardim were able to negotiate large loans all over Europe. And the commercial networks they built were based upon, firstly, large family networks. And these networks stretched back to Portugal and Spain, which in itself is amazing because they were supposed to not go back to Spain and Portugal, but they did. But Sephardic families settled all over the world, and within one family you could find brothers in Amsterdam and London, on Barbados, on Jamaica, and Suriname. They kept in contact with each other. Another way that this interconnectedness of the Sephardic world was established by the export of rabbis, teachers, ideas, and future leaders for communities from the rabbinical schools in Amsterdam and London. If you look at communities in the Americas, but also in all over Europe, Hamburg, Bordeaux, and even in the Holy Land in Israel, then there were all over the place rabbis and chazans coming from Amsterdam and London. The history of that needs to be written yet. Another way in which this interconnectedness expressed itself was through Dotar, which was a charity in Amsterdam, and it allowed the creation of an international marriage market that spanned the Sephardic world, from Danzig in Poland to Jamaica in America, and from Copenhagen to Bordeaux, Livorno, and Israel. Through this network, the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam were able to keep tabs on the co-religionists in other communities. Another way in which that interlinkedness expressed itself was through an extensive correspondence between Sephardic communities. The community in Amsterdam communicated with Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, Tiberias, in Terra Santa, with Constantinople, with Izmir, and the Ottoman Empire, with Livorno, Bordeaux, and France, with Hamburg, London, and with the Dutch colonies. And the London community corresponded also with the Holy Land and Turkey, Amsterdam, of course, but not so much with the rest of the European communities, more so with Jamaica and Barbados. This correspondence was mostly about money. Sometimes about religious questions, sometimes about family affairs when estates had to be settled, and sometimes about internal quarrels in colonial societies. And also about personnel that was being sent from Amsterdam and London to all those other countries. And lastly, the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam and London tried to influence diplomacy. When Sephardim were threatened in New York by Peter Stuyvesant, the governor there, Parnassim of Amsterdam pressured the West Indian Company to stand up for their rights. When news broke that Isaac Tartas de Castro was imprisoned in Madrid and threatened to be burned, Dutch authorities were enlisted to put pressure on the Spanish crown to prevent this execution. In the end, that didn't work out well. But, for example, when Maria Theresia, Queen of Bohemia and Hungary, banned all Jews from the Czech lands, including from Prague, Baron de Aguilar, aka Lopez Pereira, in conjunction with the Amsterdam diplomat in Prague, tried to persuade Maria Theresia to abort her plans. This also didn't work out fine. But there were many more diplomatic initiatives that were undertaken by the Amsterdam Jews and by the Jews in London. And over to David.
Thank you. The third issue that came up for us is the strength of misunderstanding about Sephardic history. And for example, just to go back to my traumatic encounter today with cheesecake and rugelach, a lady there was telling me that her son was learning about Jewish pirates in Hebrew school, which of course Ton gave us a talk on that, completely demolishing the idea. But these ideas are in the public domain, and frankly, there's not very much that we can do about it. I'm afraid, unfortunately, even in the world of Jewish genealogy, that seems to be tolerated. And if we're looking at misunderstandings, I think the first thing is the whole fleeing the Inquisition thing, because yes, people did flee the Inquisition. People also moved abroad for financial and other reasons, and people, of course, also came back to the Iberian Peninsula. I think, again, we face problems not just because there is an Ashkenazi tradition about Sephardim, but also, I think, frankly, because there's a lot of money in it now, so that we have the whole judarias in industry in Spain and Portugal. I think Judith Cohen, in one of her talks, I thought she was very helpful and very articulate on that. And then, of course, we have the Spanish and Portuguese nationality laws, which have been a further incentive for people all over the world to discover their Sephardic ancestry or imagined ancestry. And obviously, particularly, we also already have a tradition amongst Ashkenazim, a number of Ashkenazim of Sephardic ancestry, which of course is really fascinating, and there must be reasons behind it. But perhaps we run into problems when we start demanding sort of genealogical standards. And I think very often that Sephardic culture within the wider Jewish culture, meaning I think Ashkenazi culture, is sort of represented as just food and music. So more or less every video either has the songs of Maranika playing in the background, or somebody sort of desperately strumming at a guitar, and Sephardic recipes and so on, which is great, but I think not true. And then, of course, finally, we have the whole crypto-Jewish thing. And I think it's indicative that when we actually had a talk on that subject, indeed, I was speaking, we decided that we would make that patrons only, simply because, you know, when one discusses this objectively and hopefully carefully in the wider community, one still gets a whole lot of aggression. So we have the case, of course, of Professor Judith Neulander, who is an academic folklorist, and her researching into claims of crypto-Jewish ancestry in New Mexico led to such abuse. I think I may be mistaken, but I think she even received a death threat, that she very largely went and decided she would focus her studies elsewhere. And you know, even in sort of, you know, small scale, myself, when I sort of touched on the subject, I was immediately on various social media branded as a Nazi and a racist, and I understand people, a couple of people, wrote to my imagined employer to get me fired, and it's quite kind of difficult that if one wants to have an objective discussion on evidence-based genealogy, we run into problems. And I think, well, why are we discussing this in an evidence-based Sephardic genealogy group? And I think it's because that is the sea in which we are swimming. And I think the establishment of the Sephardic diaspora group on Facebook now about 10 years ago by Ton Michael Wass and myself, later joined by Jarrett Ross, it was important because it actually established a space in which Sephardic researchers were dominant. And I have to say, before the meeting, sort of, Jeanette was suggesting that there's a very sort of diverse agenda at the London forthcoming London conference. I think that's not how a lot of Sephardic researchers are viewing it. That, I mean, at the same time, of course, naturally, most of the people there will be Ashkenazi, so that should be the focus of the conference. But perhaps we are being slightly pushed to the fringes, and you know, some might suggest that as well as having our own groups such as the Sephardic diaspora on Facebook, it may be at some point we also want to have our own conferences. And I mean, just to summarize on this issue of the strength of misunderstandings, that when we started, we never expected that, you know, it would be anything political. You know, we're sort of putting out statements to the Portuguese media on Abramovich, and having all this nonsense with crypto Jews and Jewish pirates and so on. I think that's the last thing we expected. You know, we thought we would be in some sort of genteel backwater of academia. But anyway, that was the third thing we picked out. So Ton, over to you.
Yeah. What we learned about was about the importance of Italy for Sephardic research. There have always been Jewish communities in Italy since Roman times. In the 16th century, Pisa, Ferrara, Venice, Livorno all got their share of Spanish and later Portuguese Jewish refugees. They mingled with the existing Romaniot communities to the extent that these communities adopted Sephardic rites, and also to the extent that we don't know who in those communities were Sephardic and who were Romaniot. They mingled so far in such large quantities, and so few documentary sources for that period, that it's almost impossible to separate them, and perhaps we should not. We should speak about Italian Jews and not Sephardic or Ashkenazic Jews. Especially Livorno continued to receive many refugees from Portugal and Spain, and also Sephardic immigrants from elsewhere. And they helped build Livorno into a commercial metropole with far-flung commercial networks consisting of merchants, brokers, bankers, etc. And it's also situated halfway between East and West, and they formed a bridge between the Sephardic communities in Constantinople and Amsterdam and London and elsewhere. And sometimes literally so, because Amsterdam sent money each year to the Holy Land to support communities there. And they also made a stop halfway in Livorno, where they were able to exchange guilders for patagons, which was the current currency in the Holy Land. Alain Netjar gave 2 talks to Sephardic World about Livorno Ketubot, and his publication about these Ketubot has very much enlarged our understanding of the connections between East and West, between Livorno and Portugal, Livorno, Amsterdam, and London. Among other insights, he told us how the Jews in Livorno helped establish Sephardic communities in Tunis. And Luca Ascoli helped us with an overview of literature about Italian communities. David.
Thank you. I mean, carrying on from what Tom was saying about Alain Nedjar and of course others' work on Italy. I mean, something that's I didn't expect when I started genealogy was the sheer volume of information that we have for Sephardic studies. So, for example, when I started, I knew about the 6-volume Bevis Marks records in London, and then, of course, as I sort of met Ton and Tom was digging away, the sheer size and scale of the Amsterdam archives became clear, and we sort of became aware of other archives and resources as well. But I mean, there's so much out there. So, for example, we had Tere Samama talk about the diplomatic archives, and you know, these are from multiple countries, and not just the correspondence between the diplomatic missions and the central governments, but also lots of Jews were receiving nationality and getting passports, having their life events registered, and obviously appearing in the courts. We had Jean-Claude Coupermintz talk about the Alliance, the archives of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which again was not something I really thought about at the outset. Unfortunately, they didn't have a huge amount on pupils, but it's not just that. I mean, there are so many institutions operating that involve Sephardim. I mean, Freemasonry we've touched on a couple of times, and hopefully we can get a talk on that. Ali went to visit the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, which is just another treasure trove. I mean, perhaps multiples of the size of Amsterdam. And the truth is, we don't really know what's there. Again, the Inquisition archives, we started off just looking at the reports of the autos de fe, just the sort of the names and summaries of people, as our knowledge and our Portuguese improved, we started looking at the processos, the trial documents. But the truth is, I mean, even now, for example, when I look at a processo, I'll mostly quickly flick through to find the genealogy section and see if there's any interesting names in the margins. But that might be sort of 4 pages out of 400. Also, we're just starting to think about the Portuguese and Spanish secular archives and church archives. I mean, in one of her talks, Carla Vieira, who is, I think, somebody who's going to become increasingly important to us, in a throwaway phrase, she just mentioned about the Lisbon notarial archives, and I think we'd never heard of these. We'd never heard of these before. We had Daniel Smith Ramos talk to us about the older Spanish archives, and so I think within the Sephardic research we have almost the opposite problem that we have in Ashkenazi research. We just have so much that our question is not so much to start digging, but about where we focus and how we are going to be organizing the data, and so I think that's something interesting and positive to look forward to in the future, and possibly this is somewhere where artificial intelligence is going to help us, if not perhaps even make us redundant. So that's the fifth point, just the sheer volume of data that we have encountered that is not something I had expected at all. So, Tom.
One of those places where there are many more sources than we expected is Morocco. I always thought of Morocco to have been sort of a black hole. We know who comes out, who goes in, but not what happened inside. But the picture is not as bleak as I thought. First, there are more Jewish sources inside Morocco than we knew, as Jacob Marash and Rekel Levi Toledano pointed out in their talks to Sephardic World. But their state is precarious and their status is unclear and threatened. So there also is a lot of work to be done. And then there are sources outside Morocco that enlighten us, the archives of the Alliance Française, which David already mentioned, diplomatic archives in France, in Holland, the notarial archives of the Netherlands of France, and maybe Gibraltar as well. One of the sources that we have, diplomatic archival sources, have been published by the Baron de Castries. He went through French and Dutch diplomatic archives and published a series of some 10 volumes with translations of documents that he had discovered everywhere. And each of these volumes is maybe 800 pages. So there's already a lot that has been published. Rekel Levi Toledano showed how combining archives and DNA enabled her to reconstruct her Levi family. And Jacob Marash gave an overview of existing sources and cemeteries and how he thinks that we can tackle the information that is coming from them. David?
So, yeah, another issue is the complexity of the Inquisition. So I had this old-fashioned English education that we learned that good Queen Bess defeated the Spanish Armada and saved this country from this evil sort of proto-Nazi tribunal. But in fact, I think what I've discovered is, and perhaps this is controversial, is I'm not going to say the Inquisition wasn't that bad, but it was neither the sort of Monty Python and Mel Brooks view on one side, or the Black Legend on the other. That is to say, it was a judicial tribunal. It worked to rules. Now, we might not, of course, agree with its values and its goals, but that it was a rational institution, perhaps in a way that people looking for witches in England and Germany perhaps were not. And I think learning about the structure of the Inquisition, and if you haven't seen Ron Hasner's talk a couple of weeks ago on torture, I really recommend that, because he gave a version that we, well, I can only speak for myself, a version of events that I don't quite agree with, but I think it was really, really interesting to hear what he was saying about that. And I think, I mean, clearly the Inquisition was an institution that existed for hundreds of years and operated differently in different places at different times. But the whole thing that we had at the start of fleeing from the Inquisition, I think is not completely true. And if I might offer a slightly dissident thought, I mean, it perhaps, I mean, clearly it was brutal. But if perhaps we compare it to some of the social media companies during COVID, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of push us into a certain direction and a certain way of thinking as they perceived it, and maybe, of course, in reality, for our own good. I mean, admittedly, of course, you know, Facebook and Twitter weren't burning people alive, but perhaps exclusion from social media is almost as bad. So what I would suggest is the Inquisition is, and I think this is something we need to look at more closely. That I started, as I said, first of all with the Black Legend. And then of all the different historiographies and views of the Inquisition, I was most persuaded by Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the historian father of the Prime Minister, and his view was essentially it was this sort of anti-Semitic endeavor. But I no longer see it like that. I think it's, you know, obviously not in the interests of people who wish to be normative Jews, but I do think perhaps there was a certain rationality is not the right word, but a certain logic and purpose to it, which of course is not to whitewash it, but just to say, I think it's something we need to understand in a perhaps a less prejudicial way than we have in the past. Tom?
One constant factor in the history of all Western Sephardic communities is the support for Terra Santa. And that support was organized in two ways. The first way was emissaries were sent out from Hebron, Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias. They traveled the Western world, the Eastern world, and they gathered money everywhere, with which they went back to Israel and hopefully spent it there. The other form happened in the form of regular support from Sephardic communities in Western Europe and later in the Americas. And this was organized by themselves and resulted in yearly shipments of money to Terra Santa. But the way it was organized was different in the diverse communities. Some, like Livorno and Bordeaux, had separate societies for Terra Santa, and they gathered money, and then they waited for emissaries to come, and if they liked them, they gave them a lot of money. If they didn't like them, they gave half of their money and held back the rest for another emissary. In Amsterdam and London, there were no separate societies for Terra Santa. The support was a task of the communities themselves. So you can find no charity with the name Terra Santa in Amsterdam or in London. They gathered money and sent it to Terra Santa every year. There's and that's a task that every Sephardic community that I know of so far has taken upon itself to send money. Curaçao sent its money through Amsterdam. Barbados and Jamaica gave their gifts through Amsterdam, through London. And I'm sure that other communities who contributed to Terra Santa either did that through Amsterdam or London or sent it directly themselves. These two forms of support sometimes clashed. In Amsterdam, emissaries were not always welcome, because in Amsterdam they felt that they gave each year a substantial sum for Eretz Israel, and these emissaries were not always looked upon as totally honest. And to be sure, they gathered a lot of money, but they also cost a lot of money. And at some point it was established that the money they needed for their own support and their families, which often came with them, must not exceed 25% of what they gathered. But sometimes it was half the money. So in Amsterdam, they looked with suspicion upon these emissaries and sometimes refused them and sent them back empty-handed, but not always. They also gave money, but then ordered the people in Israel to not send emissaries for another 10 years and just make do with the regular sums of money that they sent. These sums were substantial. It could be 1,000 guilders in 1 year. And it was it almost always arrived safely. There was a point in which there was a crisis caused by Ashkenazim coming to the Holy Land circa 1700, and they behaved themselves in such a way that the Arab rulers of the time started to take them hostage and ask for ransom for them. At that point, the Parnassim of Constantinople intervened, and they formed a committee for the Holy Land in 1728. And from that point on, all the money that came from Amsterdam went through Constantinople to the Holy Land. And in the 19th century, things changed again. You got more communication, newspapers, pamphlets, and money was sampled through publicity campaigns. And one person very good at that was Lord Simon, no, not Simon, Moses Montefiore, who traveled to the Holy Land himself a lot of times and established more modern ways of collecting money and sending them to Eretz Israel. But the support from London and Amsterdam and other communities continues until this very day. David.
So whilst we have obviously looked at Terra Santa, one of the things that we were thinking about when we were reviewing the talks over the last 3 years is where are the gaps in our knowledge, or at least coverage, and that's to say where should we be looking at in future. One of them, of course, is Hamburg Altona. We had a talk by Hugo Martins on the subject, but it does seem to be that this is an undercovered area, because of course this is one of the earliest Western Sephardic communities and part of the whole network. But I think just sort of history, essentially, that community ceased to exist in 1933, and awful to say, but there's probably not enough descendants surviving interested to look at that. And also the archives have been divided, I think rather foolishly, between Germany and Israel. And also I think the nature of us researching Sephardim, perhaps other than people in the Netherlands, German is quite a difficult language for us. But I do hope that going forward we can have much more on the community in Hamburg, because it's important, and it deserves to be studied and remembered. With the communities in France, I mean, it's a different story, because there is a lot of scholarship there. I think we should perhaps have found speakers from the Cercle de Genealogie Juif, and we will do so. I mean, Ton and I gave a talk essentially on resources for sort of Bordeaux and Bayonne, but I think it's also interesting to look at the earlier communities in France, and the importance in just the whole evolution of the Western Sephardic diaspora. Another place that oddly we haven't covered is Brazil, because after the United States, Brazil is actually our second largest viewership, and I think Brazil often appears, for example, in relationship to the Netherlands or sugar or slavery. But I do think that we need to look very specifically at Brazil, not just the Dutch period, but I think the Portuguese period, sort of before the Dutch arrived, and what was there after the Dutch left is interesting, and also India we have barely touched on. And I think India is absolutely fascinating, because if you look at the map of India, basically it's like a triangle coming down, and on one side we have the Portuguese colony of Goa. On the other side we have the English Fort St. George, later Madras today, Chennai, and in the middle we have the Golconda diamond mines, I think owned by the wonderfully named Nizam of Hyderabad, and you can almost see the power moving from Portugal to England as the sort of merchant presence or Western Sephardic, New Christian merchant presence decreases in Goa and expands on the English side, and also I think India is significant for other things. So for example, we were talking about Alain Najjar's scholarship in Italy. He and colleagues have also looked at the community in Tunis. And one of the big things about having a community in Tunis was because they obtained red coral out of the Mediterranean, which was very much prized by the Indians. And so there was a trade going from that, running out of Livorno through Tunis to India. And then we see the diamonds coming back, first of all, to Portugal, later to Antwerp, later still to Amsterdam. And so perhaps whilst in terms of population, India hasn't been hugely important for us, I think in terms of the evolution of the economic history, it's absolutely fascinating. And of course, I mean, we can say that the British presence in India, excuse me, was first of all the result of a royal marriage, allegedly organized by a couple of Western Sephardim, and then later by this fascinating character, Abraham Nabarro, who seems to have been an interpreter for the English, who were terribly arrogant with the Mughals when they arrived in Bombay and nearly got kicked out. And only by Nabarro's intervention did the English maintain their foothold. And who knows what the history of the world might have been, but for these few Sephardim. So I think India certainly deserves our attention. We've had a number of talks on the Balkans. So Francis Friedman spoke to us about Bosnia. Joseph Benetov gave an excellent talk on Bulgaria. And for those attending the London conference, he's talking there and well worth hearing. Penina Zilberman spoke about Romania, and Esther Danon-Gitman spoke about her family's experience in the Holocaust in Yugoslavia. I realized in compiling this list, we haven't had a talk specifically on Greece, which, given the importance of Salonika, is a loss. But I think also if we could just take a step back and just look at the whole Ottoman Balkans, I think that's a fascinating area for us. I mean, clearly there are lots of other specific areas to be touched, and obviously in terms of the Ottoman Empire, hopefully over the next period of time we can build up research there in the same way that we have in Western Sephardim, and to a lesser degree with Megorashim in North Africa. But as I say, looking back, I think we've been surprised by the gaps in terms of geography, and I think also in terms of perhaps a lot of culture and institutions. We have much more to be said. But Tom will now discuss something that has proven hugely of interest to our audience.
Yes, when we look back at 3 years of Sephardic World, we discovered that our talks on Curaçao, Suriname, Jamaica, Barbados are among the best watched, both in terms of a live audience and in terms of people visiting our YouTube channel and looking at these talks after they were given. We did an interview with Ainsley Henriquez, which was also very well received. So we hope to continue talks about the Caribbean. For example, we could cover St. Thomas and the lesser known Antilles, and of course Curaçao again, Suriname again, Jamaica again. The Jewish communities in the Caribbean played a significant role in the development of the economy of the respective colonies. Above all, through their involvement in sugar and coffee plantations like in Suriname, as well as their engagement in trade and commerce on, for example, Curaçao. And despite their minority status, Jews managed to carve out a unique position for themselves in these colonies, also thanks to their connections with other Jewish communities around the Atlantic world. And really, the history of the Jews in the Caribbean should be studied in the context of the Atlantic world. They established synagogues, schools, they started cemeteries, they started charities that preserved their distinct identity and allowed them to pass on their customs for future generations. But you can't talk about the Jews in the Caribbean without talking about slavery and the complex relationship between the Jewish community and the enslaved population of Suriname and elsewhere. Some Jews owned and traded in slaves, and others expressed concern about the morality of the slave trade and spoke out against it. But it is an important an important subject in the life of these Jewish communities. Also controversial one, but not one that we can just skip over. There's a contrast between the Dutch and English colonies, we found out, and in the latter, the English colonies, economic and political rights of the Jews were much more restricted. They could not own more than a few slaves, so could not start a plantation unless they converted. And the threat of expulsion was always there. Nevertheless, they enjoyed religious freedom. In the Dutch colonies, the position of the Jews was much stronger, especially in Suriname, where they, at one time, they were 1/3 of the white population of that country. And they were very important in the plantation economy. And this presents us with the Pesach problem, among others discussed by Aviva Ben-Ur, which consists of the problem that Jews, when they celebrate Pesach and the delivery from slavery in Egypt, and how that contrasted with having slaves themselves. And Aviva Ben-Ur gave there a very touching and insightful talk about. David.
So another thing that has become very apparent to us, but we're not quite sure how it will work out, is the impact on technology in our work. So essentially, as we said before, we really only have this Sephardic space thanks to social media, in particular Facebook. And then, for example, these talks, thanks to Zoom. And I think perhaps we could have done it a few years ago with Skype, but perhaps certainly before pandemic, nobody was really thinking in that way. But the technologies I really want to focus on are, well, first of all, DNA, because I think after the Caribbean and slavery, our talks on DNA have been most popular, which is fortunate because Ton and I really don't understand the subject. But we have friends who do. So we've had talks by Adam Brown, Michael Wass, Raquel Levy-Toledano, Wim Penix, Inés Perez Noguero, and especially on why DNA, the DNA that men inherit from their fathers, and I think there's a lot of very important work being done there, and I think perhaps the next stage is how we weave together the genetic research with the family trees we're creating, the genealogical research, and putting it into a some sort of geographical information system, and that's perhaps something to think about over the next few months. I think the second significant development after DNA is the project being led by David Silveira, using transcribers. This is artificial intelligence, essentially to be able to train the software to in inverted commas read documents, because this is just going to open up huge archives to us in due course. I mean, obviously at the moment the focus is on the accounts books of the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community of London, but the potential is massive, not just for the archives of the Western Sephardic congregations, but for the wider Portuguese archives as well. And of course, there are projects also in Portugal, led, well, not led by, but certainly involving Carla Vieira, who we mentioned before. There is another project in Brazil, and hopefully in due course, we shall reach a point where I think in German research they're almost there, where you can put almost any German text in and get something meaningful from that. I think also, though, we've reached the point where we need to, as I was just saying, thinking about how we can put everything together. I think the obvious place to start is for the Western Sephardim, because I think Ton has estimated that between about 1600 and 1800, only maybe 200 to 250,000 Western Sephardim lived, and I think we probably have most of their names, if we don't have them already in databases, accessible to us, and I think between these various projects with genetics, with AI, with GIS, geographical information systems, and just sort of databases and rules-based systems, and certainly Ali is doing a lot of sort of interesting work around that. The fantasy is that within however many years we will have this complete mapped family tree of the Western Sephardim, onto which all of the other information from these various archives and resources we've discussed over the last 3 years can be put together, and that will be, I think, a significant advance in knowledge. I don't think anyone has ever achieved that. That's the future. I mean, I'm afraid all that's missing is money. So if anyone has a few sort of millions that they can pass our way, or indeed has contacts with people who work in trust, or better own trusts, please. And I'm not being flippant. I think this is very, very serious work. Obviously, we've had a discussion with one of our members who is at a major university, and I think really what's missing is funding, and obviously with our patrons, we're extremely grateful that you keep the show on the road. But obviously, if anyone wishes to sell their house and give us the money, we would not complain. But the final point, I will pass over to Tom.
We have had about 10 talks about family history on Sephardic World, and common factors in those family histories are traumatic events like the Inquisition, like the expulsion, and the extreme mobility of Sephardic families. Of course, the one is connected to the other, but after Jews were expelled from Spain and fled Portugal, they didn't stop in the first country that they came to, but they traveled elsewhere. And this makes for extremely difficult research. Sometimes we don't know where families living in Amsterdam came from, in Portugal or Spain. We don't even know if they are from Spain or Portugal. And another thing that's obvious is that you need many languages to be able to construct your family history, because a family could start in Portugal or Spain, so you would need Spanish and Portuguese to study them. Then they went to Amsterdam, London, France. You need French, German, some Dutch, English, and then they even went further away to other countries. And I'm not even speaking of families moving to the Ottoman Empire. For that, you would need to learn Turkish, etc. So Sephardic genealogy is enormously complex, but it's also enormously rewarding. And what we see these days is that families that have been split up ever since Spain and Portugal are beginning to reunite through our modern day possibilities of communication, through DNA, through archival research. And so what we are seeing is that these fractured families are slowly establishing contact again. And then so far as Sephardic World contributes to that, we are contributing to the continuing story of the Sephardim. I think we have spoken for about an hour, David, so let's...
Yes. Can I just comment on sorry, Ali, can I quickly comment on something that Judith posted? She just posted a word, Baghdad, and I think again, when we started off, we started very much with the Western Sephardim, and then almost naturally that blended into to Morocco and Italy, and then with sort of Eastern Sephardi and Mizrahi worlds. The issue I think that we originally had looking at Eastern Sephardim is that for Western Sephardim we have records that all of these Portuguese-speaking communities were run by merchants, and they left huge amounts of information, and of course also with the Inquisition and the civil records. In the Ottoman Empire, many of the communal records have been destroyed. But I think certainly in my own thinking, where I'm coming to is, rather than just looking at Eastern Sephardim, it's maybe more useful look at the sort of Ottoman Empire and former Ottoman Empire as a block, given that the we're hoping that there's a mountain of undiscovered information sitting in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, even with sort of genetics and other things, we're sort of discovering that people went. I think we had a talk on or maybe we didn't, but on the sort of Lanyardo family that went from sort of Spain to Italy to Syria to Iraq to India.
Yeah.
And so we're finding all of these connections, and so maybe we can be including the Ottoman Empire. I'm afraid that the problem we have is it normally always comes back to money. There's just not enough resources to do everything we want. But thank you for commenting on Baghdad, because I think that's useful. And also I think, I belong to a sort of mixed Sephardi Mizrahi community. I think it's quite important because the generation that came from places like Iraq and Egypt and Syria are not getting any younger, and I think it's quite important that we should start work on those countries whilst we still have people who can guide us there. But that is my soapbox. Ali, if you would like to unmute.
Yes, I just want to offer a vote of thanks to David and Tom for just, I think the record of the Sephardic World meetings speaks for itself in terms of its breadth and depth of subjects, and it's just I think it's certainly changed my life. I mean, a lot of people here will have been researching their family genealogies for decades and have had enormous knowledge. But I literally came to this about 3 years ago. It's around the same sort of time that the talk started. And it's opened up a whole new chapter in my life. And, I came to it as an outsider, as an interloper, looking into the family history of my wife's ancestry, the Gomez de Costa family who came to London, or the Gomes de Coste, as I understand it should be pronounced. But expanded from that, so that I'm now in my retirement, since 18 months ago, or nearly 2 years ago, I've taken up a sort of academic research, and I'm doing a master's thesis and hopefully later a PhD on the London Spanish and Portuguese community. So, it's kind of opened up the next, I'd say, at least 5 years of my life, and hopefully beyond. And it's just an amazing thing. And along the way, I've made some great friends. I mean, there's people I've met in person, or people that I only know from, across a Zoom screen, but who I would regard now as friends, that we meet with on a weekly basis. And, I think from my personal point of view, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks, but also just generally for as I say, the depth and breadth of the information and subjects that are being covered is just fantastic, and long may it continue.
Thank you, Ali. Bernard Miller, would you like to unmute?
Thanks. Yeah, I want to echo the vote of thanks and just say that when I got into this, and I never knew I was getting into genealogy, I was just looking for a family story that I'd been told in the 1960s, and suddenly in the 1990s thought, I wonder what happened to that person. I had no idea what I was getting into. And like most beginners, I had no idea about genealogy. And one of the things that I've really benefited from this group in is the rigor that you have brought to it. Because, I started off with all of the beginner's mistakes. This name looks like that name, therefore they must be related. These people were married to these people, so therefore they must be related. These people have the same names and came from the same places, and therefore they must be related. And I have learned that a lot more rigor is required, and fortunately is possible if you're doing Sephardic research in ways that it's not if you're doing Ashkenazi, or not necessarily. And I kind of feel guilty because, like David, I'm half and half. And I keep meaning to start on my dad's Ashkenazi side, but I never quite get round to it because of this constant deluge of Sephardi relatives with interesting stories that have to be followed up. But I did want to throw in a couple of things. One is, as always, you stopped at Germany. And in the IAJGS, I will be giving a talk this summer on Scandinavia, the Sephardic Jews who made it to Scandinavia, and some of what happened to them. Although most of the Sephardic families have since disappeared, there are fascinating stories. And one of the things that I will be presenting, which I think is really important to people doing Sephardic research, and it's stuff that I've only become aware of in the last couple of months, is 4 towns which were established by King Christian IV, in the same way as Altona and Glückstadt, which are better known, to which he actively invited Sephardim, and for which there are now cemeteries that have been recovered and or restored. In the case of Glückstadt, the cemetery which was destroyed in quotes by the Nazis in 1943, they have managed to recover 100 gravestones. 90 of them are Sephardic, some of them with very fine artwork, and a lot of them with a lot of information that people who are doing, some people who are doing Sephardic research will want to know. The town of Rendsburg, 70 kilometers to the north of Glückstadt, has got a Jewish museum in a recovered and restored synagogue and Jewish school. So there's a lot of stuff there that I think will open up paths. And also, I gave a talk to the Jewish Genealogy Society of Great Britain on the Sephardim, and it was on my relatives that I had been tracking that had made it to India. But the possibilities of research are phenomenal because most of the governors of Portuguese India were new Christians. And there are actually portraits of all of them. So there's 124 governors of Portuguese India for whom there are some biographies and portraits, which is something that we don't often get. So there's enormous amounts to be done. And the final thing that I wanted to throw in, I don't want to hog the floor, I've mentioned them before, the East Sepharad group based in Buenos Aires, who do meetings every Thursday evening with the most fantastic speakers, many of them really serious academics who've done a lot of important work. Their focus tends to be, and it's part of what we're missing, the Eastern Mediterranean. So they've got a lot of stuff on Greece and Turkey and the Balkans and even further east. And they've also got quite a lot of stuff on North Africa. Most of their stuff is in Spanish. They also do Sunday sessions in Ladino and Hakatia. But for people who have Spanish, they are well worth following. So I throw that in. But I do want to thank Ton and David for the rigor which I'm trying to adopt and adapt because I think it is a really useful tool for sifting out what is genuine and what is, in many cases, and in mine, particularly wishful thinking.
Thank you. I should say, actually, Ton reminded me to mention Scandinavia and Denmark in particular, and I'm afraid I completely forgot. Daniela.
No, I also want to thank you guys. You're awesome, and you're how I got into all of this when I was first started writing my book, and I want to say, I think I was the first
Yes.
one.
You were one of our first speakers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you all for that. And also I'm applying for a graduate degree in forensic genetic genealogy. So hopefully I'll be involved in more work in this field. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Very, very, very interesting. Hopefully, if you have to do a dissertation, you can do it on a Sephardic subject. Bruce. Oops. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, Bruce, you're muted.
This is sort of like the Passover meal where the Uncle Bernard, who you know will be giving you the full history of the event, is going to speak, and you kind of make sure that you've gotten the extra helping that you need. But that being said, and there being no shot clock on these comments, I just want to make sure that you do hear from all parts of the world. Here in Stanford, the rigor makes a huge difference. Ton and David have been taskmasters in terms of that, and it evolves into, I think, a code of conduct for the group that is self-imposed, but professionalizes what you're doing. I thought I would just say a very quick few words on what David and I have really tried to push at Stanford. I am at Stanford. I am part of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, among other things that I do here. And there is a new school for sustainability called the Doerr School, named for the benefactor John Doerr and his family, who've given $1.1 billion to that. It's a school of sustainability, and I've tried, and unfortunately, academia does move slow, David. It does, and it requires constant prodding, nudging, annoying, bumping into people, and re-engaging, and I'm doing that. But the notion that David Silvestri and Ali's work could support a new, along with others, new forms of technologically rigorous but also novel research is the notion is that there are migrations that have been caused by climate and other events, and that the Sephardim, God bless us all, because of the record keeping that was done to ostracize, turn out to be some of the better documented. It's the irony of this group that that's so. And so I do push it forward. Stanford loves to take endowments, it seems, and they're pretty good at it. So as you probably know, private universities, I don't know about public as much, there's always a hit list that every dean keeps for that magical conversation that a wealthy benefactor has. Well, what are your top things that you'd like to have money to fund? So if we can get on that list in any of the schools, that would be a nice place to be. I think the work that's been demonstrated again by Ali and David and others, the DNA stuff is enough to say that it can go the next step. So that's that's my commitment to the group to keep pushing. So thank you both.
Thank you both.
Thank you. I think $1.1 billion would certainly sustain Ton and myself.
I was starting small.
Francis.
Yes, well, yes, again, I'm going to say thank you for all this. I grew up with a Sephardi family and being very well aware that I was nothing like the Ashkenazim in Prestwich in Manchester, nothing like them, much more sort of noisy, colourful and outrageous. And I loved it. And I thank you for doing this. What I would like is a timescale. I am quite happy to help do it, but what I'm finding, because I'm not an academic, I'm somebody who lives with the interactions. I make theatre, I do all sorts of stuff. I'm just wondering if we could do a sort of parallel timescale of how this was laid out. I would be very happy to help do it. I think it would be quite complicated, but I also think that it would be quite clarifying to know what was going on in parallel and what was going on at the same time and where. Is that possible, David and Ton? Is that a possible request?
I think there is so much going on that it's complicated.
Yes.
When I was working modeling world commodity markets, gosh, about 20 years ago or more, and virtual reality was a thing, or going to be a thing. I had this fantasy that we could all put on goggles and we could see sort of streams of light going from one country to another and understanding what was going on there. I think that was naive. I do think that and then this is a half-developed thought, but with sort of so-called geographical information systems, that essentially just using maps, and that's basically, we've got databases behind that. I think that there must be a way that we can better understand. But you see, the problem is there's just so much going on. If we've got a community that's in 30 different places, and significant events are happening in each of these places at least every few years, we get absolutely overwhelmed. And the question is, how do we display that in a way that is useful and meaningful? And I suspect it is that if people can sort of just close in on particular areas and times and so forth, that we can do somewhere there. I have to say that I've always been interested in what games manufacturers have been, video game makers have been doing, because generally speaking, they tend to be ahead of the curve. But it's a really interesting question. How do we display so much information in a way that it is actually useful to the viewer? And I don't necessarily know we have an answer to that, but I have to say I personally like maps, and perhaps that's the way. If we have family trees that we can then physically map, and then all the other information that we have goes on top of it. That's both communal information from records, and then what's going on in the countries and where the borders are and so on. But it may be that there's a technology sort of in the pipeline that will resolve that. I mean, presumably that's what big data companies and Google and so on are thinking about. And to add to that, one of the Bobs was making a comment on sort of academic, becoming credible to academia, and I think that's and of course Bruce was sort of touching on the same thing. But I think that's something we can do. But I think perhaps we need to think a bit more about databases. But
Yes,
that's just one person's thought, and I'm a bit out of the loop on tech these days anyway.
maybe those of us who come, I mean, my root was from Egypt
Yeah.
and Lebanon and places. Maybe those of us who've got those roots and know something about them personally could put something together which would eventually connect at that kind of experiential level, because there is this dialectic, isn't there, between that massive mapping and locational stuff and the individual. I do a lot of theatre based on that. I mean, I would love to talk about that. It's probably not the best place to do it, but how one might set up cognitive, intuitive structures that would enable us to think through those dialectics, those questions, and to do it not just as a huge group, but as individuals and small groups too. Maybe I'm making it up as I go along.
But
Does that
also,
make sense?
I think, and Ben, I'm sorry, I'll shut up and pass to Jacob. I think we will see sort of emergent patterns that are not necessarily obvious to us at the moment. But I mean, where that leads, I mean, I don't really know, but I should shut up. And Jacob, would you like to unmute?
Yes, good evening, good afternoon for some of you. I'm new, I'm quite new to the group. I think about a year. I'm highly impressed, and I learn every time something new. I just have, so for all the comments, I just have one or two comments. The last one relate to Francis, Egypt. There's a lot about Sephardic Jews in Egypt. If I can only remind of Maimonides, he arrived there before the Inquisition, but and also we have Sephardic Jews in Japan, and these are areas which we should not forget about. Thank you.
Thank you. And we also, of course, we've had Yves Fedida talk about that, and I think Mr. Nakamuli is going to be talking at the conference in London. Of course, the problem in Egypt is the Egyptian government is sitting on the most valuable data to us, but who knows? Maybe that will change.
Thank you.
But, and just a quick word on what we will be doing. The idea is to reduce these talks, at least for the moment. I mean, if it doesn't work, we can go back to having every week, but to have just a couple a month, because we thought it was valuable also to produce something textual. And perhaps that will be quite largely based on the talks, but to sort of better organize the data and make it accessible to more people. But we're already working on our first. I'm not sure what we're going to call it, a newsletter perhaps. But if that doesn't work, we'll just return to this, and we'll just of course see what our patrons want. But thank you everyone for your kind words. I think, to be honest, perhaps they're more directed at Tom than me. I'm just very happy to be coming here for the ride, and I hope it doesn't upset our Americans too much, but I very much like the old-fashioned Victorian English way of amateurism and just enjoying the journey. But Ton, I'm sorry I've been yakking a lot, so what's up for you?
Thank you, David. As always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible. And we also thank our viewers on YouTube. Next week, there will be no meeting for the reason that David gave, but also because I will be away from home at that time and not able to attend. And in 2 weeks' time, we will have another meeting. So I hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time. And thank you for all of your support.